Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Gooden, and I have the pleasure of serving as Interim Dean of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs here at Virginia Commonwealth University. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to a signature event of our school, which is the 2018 Wilder Symposium. This symposium is an event that is directed by our namesake, the Honorable L. Douglas Wilder, who you'll be hearing from momentarily, and it really epitomizes his leadership legacy and the legacy of his career in terms of addressing challenges for communities at the state level, at the local level, and nationally. And I know we have an outstanding group of panelists tonight where we will have vibrant discussions as we work towards solutions that are based from individuals in our communities. I would like to introduce and welcome a representative from President Rao's office. Unfortunately, President Rao could not be with us this evening, but Matt Conrad, who is Executive Director of Government and Board Relations for Virginia Commonwealth University, is here to bring remarks. He's also the former Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor McDonnell. Matt.
Hello and good evening. I am very honored to be here to represent our university president, Dr. Rao. As Dr. Gooden said, he's out of state traveling on university business, or he would be here himself. I'm particularly honored to bring greetings to this gathering, both because it has been called together by Governor Wilder and because of the incredibly important issues being discussed. I happened to hear on the radio today an interview given by Governor Wilder addressing the state of housing and education policy, and I thought his words were worth repeating here. He said, "We talk about those policies today as if at some time in our history it was ever right, but it has never been right anywhere in the country for all people, for all people." To me, it's interesting how Governor Wilder's observations align not only with the purposes of this conversation today, but with the very reasons VCU was created in the first place. Please allow me to briefly explain. I know many of our VCU colleagues have heard ad nauseum, perhaps, about the Wayne Commission and its role in shaping VCU's future. But I think it bears repeating as often as possible because it needs to stay at the heart of our mission. In the late 1960s, state and local leaders were studying whether or not a new university ought to be created in Richmond from the merger of Richmond Professional Institute and the Medical College of Virginia. We all know the end result was the creation of VCU in 1968. And in the document establishing VCU, aptly called the Wayne Commission Report, Virginia Commonwealth University was given a very special charge. And if you'll indulge me, I'll read just a little bit of that charge to you. Listen to what they said in 1968 and tell me it isn't just as needed and true today. In addition to an increase in the number of opportunities, a new focus in higher education is needed. It is now apparent that the conditions prevailing in urban centers embody many of our most critical national, state, and local problems. It is equally apparent that Virginia currently has no institution of higher education, privately or state-controlled, with a primary orientation toward those pressing concerns. Rarely has any university been accorded a more timely opportunity to confront on an intellectual and a practical level the social environment which surrounds it. The city is truly its living laboratory. The urban environment offers the university great resources. Concurrently, the urban university has an obligation to participate in the solution of their problems. I think it's amazing to think how prescient that charge was in 1968 and how far we have come in accomplishing the goals set out within it. Not yet perfectly by any means, but constantly pursuing that mission. And the conversation being had here today is perfectly aligned with that charge. And there is no better place to have it than as part of the Wilder Symposium of the Wilder School. This school ranks among the top 50 in the nation's best graduate public affairs programs, moving up 12 places to number 44 in U.S. News and World Reports. But more important than rankings is the commitment to social equity, which, as Dr. Rao spoke about yesterday in our own service awards here at VCU, is the very key focus of the Wilder School. Both VCU and the Wilder School are committed to affordable housing, vibrant communities, and strong cities. And Governor Wilder's distinguished career in public service and commitment to affordable housing and education lend even greater gravity and credibility to the important work being done here. So I'll end where I started. I am incredibly honored to bring you greetings on behalf of President Rao, and I eagerly await the outcome of this timely, relevant, and essential forum that connects directly to the mission of our university, its people, and the communities we serve. Thank you so much for your participation as well.
Thank you so much, Matt. It is indeed an honor to have moderating and guiding the ship of the discussion tonight, Dr. Bob Holsworth. Dr. Holsworth is someone whom I admire and respect tremendously. He's the managing principal of Decide Smart, which is a firm that provides strategic advice, research, and civic engagement services to public sector organizations, nonprofits, and private sector companies. He has an extensive history with VCU, having served as a faculty member, professor in political science, dean of humanities and sciences, and he currently serves on the VCU Board of Visitors. Many of you will recognize and know him from not only his presence at past symposiums that we have had, but also through his extensive and sought-after political commentary, where he oftentimes gives right-on-target future predictions. So we are delighted to have with us moderating the event for this evening, Dr. Holsworth. Bob.
Thanks very much, Susan, and Matt. Thank you for your really thoughtful comments in framing the event tonight. What I'd like to do is just go over a little bit of how we're going to proceed this evening. First, what we're going to do is we're going to have 4 presentations by Congressman Scott, Melody Barnes, Tony Miller, and Bill Spriggs. And then after those presentations, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask some questions of our faculty panelists, Fabrizio Fazzulo, Genevieve Siegel-Hawley, and Ben Teresa. And then we're going to open it up for discussion from the audience as well. So it's really a sort of a 3-part evening here. And we're going to begin, I'm going to ask Governor Wilder in a second to come up and introduce Congressman Scott. And it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to be sitting next to these 2 extraordinary trailblazers in Virginia. I think as everyone knows, Governor Wilder was the first African-American elected governor in the country. Since that time, I think there's been one other, and there are a number of people running this time as well. Congressman Scott was the first African-American elected to Congress in Virginia since Reconstruction. So we're really extraordinarily fortunate to have them here this evening. And as I was coming over here and listening to all of the debate about the confirmation process of a judge, I recall that when Congressman Scott and Governor Wilder served in the Virginia General Assembly, they had a few things to say about judges in Virginia as well, and that they were very instrumental in ensuring and passing a law that said no judge in Virginia could be member of a private club that discriminated on race and gender. In fact, I think we should make that for all gubernatorial appointments today. That would be a good way of moving forward on that. But it's they did extraordinary things when they were in the Assembly. Governor Wilder, as you know, was the first governor who had Virginia as the best managed state. And he's going to introduce Congressman Scott, who has a litany and long list of accomplishments in the Congress. So it's my pleasure to introduce the namesake of the Wilder School and my great friend, L. Douglas Wilder.
Thank you very much, Bob Holsworth, for carrying me all these years, and you do an excellent job. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here, as well as to say to our good dean, Dr. Gooden, that the continuing dialogue that you speak of is something that you've done so well in the short period of time that you've been here. To the panelists and the faculty members and to the staff, all of you people who've made this event what it is to be, I'm pleased. And I think it's so important for us to understand what the role of universities and colleges today, and should have been always, and that is to commit to making certain that those who are entrusted to us for nurturing, for care, education, are not just those that we are responsible to educate. Our job is to educate the people, all of the people, to make certain that we are here fortunate enough to be in a position to say we might know a little bit about a few things to the extent that you would want to know. Our job is to share. We have an indispensable responsibility, indefeasible responsibility to educate, not just those. I say on some occasions that even though they were of different parties and different ideologies in some degree, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln had it right, because they both spoke of who? The people. Wasn't it Jefferson who said that it is the right of the people to alter and to abolish that government which is not serving the people? And wasn't it Lincoln who said that government should be of, for, and by the people? And yet, today, look how often the people are ignored and forgotten. Oh, at election time, yeah, got to have your vote and I need your money. And then when we go into our private coffers to confer, rather, what do? We talk about every excuse as to why we can't do certain things. Matt Conrad, thank you for those kind remarks. The lady that interviewed me said to me, the question she asked said, can I ask one more? I said, you said that 20 minutes ago. And she says she's going to ask some more things. But you're absolutely right. Things have never, ever been right. They've never been where they should have been in this country. So our job is to make certain that we do that. No, the world is not coming to an end, nor are we on the precipice of the abyss, nor are we at a point where we should say, oh, where are we going and where do we wish the old moon as the three? But we are in a position that we need to demand what is right and to criticize what is wrong. Life won't be easy because it never has been easy. But hopefully we might continue to light that kindles the flame of human progress. Hopefully we might be able to encourage our young people, particularly, that don't wait for others to do it, and to demand and criticize, notwithstanding what comes your way. There's nothing that can happen to you when you are yourself. And so that with perseverance and selfless commitment, we have many opportunities to do many things, and I'm grateful for those of you who are here today to do that. You mentioned Bobby Scott, and I was serving in the Senate of Virginia for a long while, I think about 6 or 7 years, Bobby. For some time after that, he came over to the Senate. I said, thank goodness somebody else came. And Bob, you mentioned the bill that relative to judges serving on the bench but belonging to country clubs that discriminate. That was not my bill. That was Bobby's bill that he brought to the Senate, that he made people understand that, no, we're not going to do this. Oh, they gave him a fit. Almost as much trouble as they gave me for the 8 years it took me to get the Martin Luther King bill passed. And yet one of the strongest supporters I ever had was Bobby Scott. I tell the story sometimes, and you'll forgive me for this personal reference. When I was running for lieutenant governor, people said, well, he's got to be crazy. That can't happen, not in Virginia. And Bobby Scott took out a little notepad, no bigger than this, and started going around talking with the members of the Senate and said, can you tell me whether you're going to be supporting Doug or not? And they gave him all sorts of things, and he said, well, can you tell me why? And by the time he finished making certain they had to explain it to him and put it out that he could understand it, I think the majority of the members of the Senate of my party got the message. And so with that degree of commitment and with that degree of understanding, he served us in the Congress, the United States Congress, having served there for the last several years. And he's serving with such distinction that if, perchance, the Democrats retain control of the Congress, Bobby Scott will be the next chairman of the Committee of Education in the United States Congress. Now, it doesn't hurt for one of us in this university to be able to call on somebody who's close to education, Matt. So close that the chairman, and if you don't believe a chairman in the United States Senate and in the United States Congress is powerful, all you got to do is look to see what's happening today. And that's why it's so important that we have this distinguished panel and the people who are here, and it is my great privilege and my great honor to introduce my great friend, Bobby Scott, Congressman Bobby Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Wilder, Bob Holsworth. It's good to be here at VCU. I had the privilege of taking advantage of some of your good faculty. Ziri Serpell, she was here a minute, I saw her a minute ago. Back in the back, served with the Education and Workforce Committee staff for almost a year, and we benefited from that good work. So it's good to see her. Now, Governor Wilder has talked about his race to lieutenant governor. Actually, it was worse than he said, because we had a meeting with my colleagues in the state Senate, and I was invited to discuss the Wilder problem, because Doug Wilder wanted to run for lieutenant governor. And we got there, and the discussion started, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And I asked I didn't ask, I just told him, I said, you know what our problem is? Our problem is that we're Democrats. And we know that Doug is the most qualified. We know that. And if he wants to run, we have to support him, because otherwise we'd be violating our fundamental principles. We know we have the best candidate. And if he loses, then we just have to go down with the ship, because we know we have to support the most qualified and can't discriminate against him because of his race. And you can see the impression on those guys, man, oh man, why did we invite him? We tried to solve the problem. And we left there as Doug, by the time we finished, he had the support of the Democratic caucus of the Senate, and the rest is history, because he became lieutenant governor because he had done such a good job in the Senate, became governor because he did such a good job as lieutenant governor, and even came back to be a good mayor for the city of Richmond. And he has done all that not just to complain and talk about problems. He actually wants to solve the problems, and that's why we have the topic today, by the people, the role of urban communities in improving housing, education, and public policy, because we don't want to just talk about the problems. We want to do something. And obviously, urban communities have a central role in addressing societal challenges, because most of those challenges can be found here in urban communities. Problems in housing are profound. One recent study found that a full-time minimum wage worker anywhere in the United States cannot afford a two-bedroom apartment. Anywhere in the United States, not just in rural areas, the little urban areas, nowhere in the United States can a full-time minimum wage worker afford a two-bedroom apartment. There's a recent program on evictions that was provoked by a study that found several communities in Virginia in the top 10 of the most evictions we found that those who actually had access to public housing were doing okay. It was those who have Section 8 eligible income trying to pay market rate rent that had the problem. The waiting list for Section 8 is so long, most people don't even have a waiting list anymore. And so those who are trying to pay market rent with low income, every time they have a flat tire, they get behind, can't catch up, and they're being evicted. Even home ownership is down, particularly amongst millennials, because they've got all the student loan and can't afford houses. The rate of home ownership is actually going down over the past few years. Homelessness is a problem in every city. And we know that studies have been done for about $200 billion spent over 10 years, about $20 billion a year. We can effectively eliminate homelessness in the United States. $200 billion. Well, that's a lot of money, but it's $200 billion. Compare that to the $2 trillion that this last tax cut is going to cost us. It's about 10%. For about 10% of that, and most of that went to the top 1% in corporations, about 10% of that, we can end homelessness in America. We also need to enforce housing discrimination because some studies found that African Americans seeking housing encounter discrimination about 20% of the time they try to seek housing. Now, the housing problem is related to the other issue listed, and that is education. Housing segregation obviously is one of the major factors to education segregation. Segregation in public schools is bad and getting worse. We had a GAO study that I asked for about a year ago, came back and said a substantial number of minorities segregated by race and class. Low-income and minority students are in segregated schools, and the rate of segregation is actually getting worse. The federal role in dealing with segregation in education obviously started in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, when the court said that in these days it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Of course, Virginia tried to comply with that during massive resistance by equally denying everybody an education by closing the schools. But we still have challenges after we got over that in equity in education. We found that right after Brown v. Board of Education, if you're going to try to make education equal, you look up and find that we're funding education with the real estate tax, guaranteeing that there will be inequality between low-income areas and high-income areas. And so in 1965, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, putting money mostly under Title I into low-income areas so that they have a fighting chance of having more equal educational opportunities. No Child Left Behind passed in the early 90s, in the early 2000s. We found that even if you got the money right, there's still achievement gaps. And you have to address, under No Child Left Behind, you have to ascertain whether there are achievement gaps and then do something about it. Well, the mechanisms didn't work and people got all frustrated, so we kind of improved that. We're giving more local control with the Every Student Succeeds Act, and we're trying to implement that now, but it's not going as well as it ought to be. Now, we need to continue the progress, because we are finding the schools are still separate and unequal. Now, the federal government is actually going backwards trying to solve this problem. We have found in this administration cutbacks in civil rights, starting with transgender students, then special education students. We know the minorities are much more likely to be identified as special ed and treated poorly. Cutbacks, they're trying to cut back in discipline. There are gross disparities in how students are disciplined. African American students much more likely to be expelled for similar offenses than their white counterparts. And there's been guidance offered by the Obama administration that shows how you can eliminate the disparities without jeopardizing school safety. This administration is trying to get rid of that guidance. There are cutbacks on access to college. This is at a time when 2/3 of the jobs of the future will require education past the high school level, and at a time when states are cutting back on their investments in education. It used to be a time, a couple of decades ago, when a state college, the cost of a state college, 2/3 of the cost was paid for by the state. Now it's 1/3, and many times less than that. Going from 2/3 to 1/3 state support doubles the cost to the student before you get to inflation. The Pell Grants haven't come anywhere close to closing that gap, and so that's where all the student loans come in. To deal with this problem, unfortunately, the Republicans have passed on a partisan basis the so-called Prosper Act. If you just want to know which direction it's going in, it cuts $15 billion out of student aid. The alternative Democratic bill puts a lot more money into student aid, makes college much more accessible, makes student loans easier to pay off, whereas the Prosper Act makes them harder to pay off. There are also cutbacks in affirmative action. And with all the confusion over the Supreme Court nominee on some issues, they're ignoring others because there's, if you talk to civil rights lawyers, they will tell you that there is serious concern about Judge Kavanaugh's position on affirmative action. There are already 4 votes on the court to eliminate all affirmative action, making it even voluntary affirmative action illegal. His 5th vote could eliminate affirmative action. The same logic could jeopardize the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. And if you have what are called disparate impacts, you just notice that some groups are being treated differently from others, but you can't prove intentional discrimination. All you know is there's disparate impact. There are many that believe that you cannot address that unless you can prove the cause, the intentional discrimination, and that would eliminate the ability to deal with any kind of discrimination. And having a Justice Kavanaugh could provide the 5th vote for making civil rights really problematic. Now, you can't discuss housing and education without discussing a little bit about criminal justice. And criminal justice policy is actually easy, but you have to make a choice. Is your goal to reduce crime and save money using evidence and research, or are you trying to get elected by codifying a bunch of simple-minded slogans and sound bites using fear-mongering and nonsense? Now, once you've answered the question, the rest is easy. Unfortunately, the slogans and sound bites have been winning. They've been loading up the prisons to the point where we have a higher portion of our population in jail today, jails and prison today than any country on earth, about 5% of the population, about close to 25% of the prisoners. So much that some studies have said that it's actually counterproductive. You got so many people in jail, you got so many children being raised by parents in prison, you got so many people with felony records can't find jobs, you got so much of the Justice Department budget being used in prisons that aren't reducing crime that could have been spent in something you know will reduce crime, that it's actually counterproductive. Now, some of the states have figured this out. Texas, their appropriations committee was told that they need $2 billion, one state, $2 billion in investments in their prisons to keep up with their growing prison population. Somebody said, ooh, that's a lot of money. Why don't we try, before we spend all that money, to put about 10% of that into prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, and maybe we won't have to spend all $2 billion. Well, they tried. They put $200 million into prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, evidence-based approach, and looked up. They didn't need to build any new prisons. In fact, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. And this creates a nice little coalition. You got all the fiscal conservatives like saving money. You got the social liberals like the more humane approach to criminal justice. And all of a sudden, they're doing the right thing on criminal justice reform. We could do the same thing if we were focused on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation. And there's several bills that do that with evidence and research. There are a bunch of bills that are obviously slogans and research. Unfortunately, both groups have bipartisan support, and we'll just have to see which direction we go in. We don't know the final result, but we do know that urban communities don't have to wait. We can focus in local spending on prevention and early intervention. We can make sure that there are alternatives to gangs. People join gangs because they want a feeling of belonging. What does that say about the community? And what does it say about a young person's choice of a gang? I mean, what other choices were out there? We need to make sure those other choices are out there so they're not joining the gangs. We need to make sure that we have dropout prevention and summer jobs to make sure, and summer activities to make sure that they get on the right track and stay on the right track. But finally, if the urban communities expect to solve any of societal problems, the first responsibility is to engage in civic affairs and strengthen civic institutions like the Crusade for Voters or the NAACP. And if they're not strong, stop complaining. Like President Kennedy said, ask not what the NAACP can do for you, ask what you can do for the NAACP. People don't belong. They say, well, it's not strong enough. Well, do you belong? No, I don't belong. Well, join. Strengthen the NAACP and the Crusade for Voters, and make sure that the Crusade for Voters focuses on elections. Any civic activity that doesn't involve voting is going to be ineffective. We hear about marches and protests and how effective they are. But if they don't target voting, they don't follow up with votes, they're ineffective. And if you just think back, when is the last time you saw the NRA out there protesting and marching? No, they just vote. And when they make a statement at a congressional hearing or a state legislative hearing and say, this is our position, they scare everybody to death because they vote. And they also give money. Regrettably, right after Parkland, the contributions to the NRA PAC just about tripled as a result. So we know that they're not playing. They're going to come out and vote. And the only alternative to that is not a complaint, but outvote them. And so, Governor Wilder, thank you for bringing us together so that we could constructively address the issues, and for holding this forum in this town hall meeting so that not only we can talk about the problems, that we can come up with solutions. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Melody Barnes, and she has had a seat at the centerpiece of American politics for some time. She served as chief counsel to U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, an experience that's very relevant today and in these last weeks. And she was also assistant to the president and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council from 2009 to 2012. And you can just remember the kind of issues that they were engaged in at that time, trying to recover from the massive recession the previous year where the economy was bottoming out, putting forward the Affordable Care Act, trying to transform the American healthcare system, being involved in major investments in education, and at the center of that was Melody Barnes. Today, she's the co-director for the Policy and Public Affairs Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia, and professor at practice at the Miller Center for Public Affairs, and distinguished fellow at the School of Law at UVA. I should also mention that Ms. Barnes is a native Richmonder, and so I'd like to introduce her and welcome her home. Thank you very much.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I have to say, I am thrilled to be here with you all this evening for all the substantive reasons. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other distinguished members of this panel. But quite frankly, I'm also excited to be here because I get to see so many people who have played an important role in my life. Governor Wilder, our governor, our mayor, his daughter and I were in graduate school together at the University of Michigan. When I was a staffer on the Hill, I got to see Congressman Scott in action. and all the work that he did. Tony Miller and I worked in the Obama administration together. Bill Spriggs and I worked together in Washington for many years. I don't have to send out Christmas cards this year because I got to see everyone here this evening, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from the others who are here today, too. I want to tell you all a story, and I want you to go back, think back to 2002, Nashville, Tennessee. At that point, that city had a poverty rate of about 65%. They had about 75,000 students in their school system. And the graduation rate, the high school graduation rate, was about 58%. 58%. And there were about 175 nonprofit organizations that had been working hard on that challenge for year after year after year. So imagine what that feels like. You've been leaning into the wheel, and the graduation rate is 58%. People were frustrated. Nonprofit leaders, students, parents, leadership of the city. And it was in 2002 that the business community came together through the Chamber of Commerce, and they decided that they wanted to study what was going on in Nashville, Tennessee. What was going wrong when so many people were leaning in? And what they realized was that the support system for students, for the school system, was fragmented. Yes, there were well-performing, high-performing nonprofits leaning in, and others doing their jobs, but it was fragmented. And as a result, they started working with about 100 of those nonprofit organizations, and they created Alignment Nashville. Alignment Nashville. And in their work, they started to develop a vision for the school system and for those students. Now, at the same time, the mayor, who was supportive of those efforts, said, well, what can we do? One of the things that had come out of the study that the Chamber of Commerce had sponsored was the fact that so many of the students in that school system were truant. A significant portion of them just weren't showing up to school. So he decided to create a task force that studied truancy, recognizing that truancy was connected to issues of public safety, of student performance, of a whole host of issues that would affect that graduation rate. In addition to that, he said, what we're going to do is we're going to develop a child and youth master plan that works in alignment with the work being done with Alignment Nashville. And they started doing their work, and they focused on issues like transportation. Literally, some of the students just couldn't get to school or get to school in a timely manner. That was a deterrent. So they started tackling that issue, among others. And ultimately, the bottom line, when you fast forward 10 years from 2002 to 2012, was that the graduation rate had gone up 20%. 20% in 10 years. And the truancy rate had dropped significantly. So why do I tell you that story this evening? One, we can talk about issues of education, and we can talk about issues of housing and transportation and our criminal justice system, and we must talk about these issues for every reason that Congressman Scott just described to us. The challenges are very real, and we need experts in each of those areas to focus on those issues. But as my husband and I often say, sometimes the thing isn't the thing. Or in this case, sometimes the thing isn't just the thing. Meaning that we have to bring all that expertise to fore to focus on these issues, but at the same time, if we don't have alignment across sectors and all of those sectors leaning in with focus on a goal and a path forward, we're not going to be able to solve our challenges. Cities like Nashville have been doing this work. In Richmond, we're leaning into this work. But we have to remember that alignment, in addition to the focus that experts bring on these issues, is absolutely critical. So 3 things that I hope that you'll remember. One, the public sector cannot solve these problems alone. We have to have the collaboration across sectors to do it. It does require the nonprofit community. It absolutely requires government. It absolutely requires the philanthropic community to come together to address these issues. Two, everybody's got a day job. How many people in the room are from nonprofit organizations? So you know what it's like. I see, yeah, I see friends. You've got a budget, you've got a raise. You've got people that you have to manage. You've got a whole range of issues that you have to focus on in addition to education, in addition to transportation, in addition to housing, depending on the mission of your nonprofit. And there are people here are from government. Who's here from government? So you know what that's like. We know what that's like. Every day you get up and it's like a fresh wave hits you and knocks you down. It's like a not so fun day at the beach because of all of the different issues that you have to focus on. And the same thing if you're from philanthropy. There are a whole swath of issues that you have to fund and that you have to focus on. You've got a day job. So what alignment requires is that there is someone, some entity that gets up every single day, 24/7, and focuses on the way that you bring all of these different sectors together and focus on mutually reinforcing activity and communication. And finally, whether you call them goal teams or alignment teams, I was just in Kalamazoo, Michigan about a week ago, and they're focusing on this kind of work, and they've got goal teams. I talked to folks in Philadelphia, Shared Prosperity Philadelphia. They've got alignment teams. But those teams, whatever you call them, bring together people across sector with issue expertise to focus on the way that they're going to get this work done, focused on a clear vision, a set of goals, the use of data and metrics, and importantly, engagement with residents of the community and those community leaders to get this work done. So I hope as we think about all of these issues, and we do a deep dive on all of these issues, and we think about them in our communities, and we think about them in cities across the country, and in particular our city, that we also remember alignment, alignment, alignment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melody Barnes. Our next speaker is Tony Miller, and I didn't know that Melody was going to set him up so beautifully because Tony comes from a background in technology investing. He was most recently a senior partner and chief operating officer of the Vistria Group, a private equity firm that he co-founded. But from 2009 to 2013, he was Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Department of Education, where he oversaw day-to-day operations and $100 billion in one-time education funding as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Obama administration's response to the economic crisis that they faced when they came into office. And as you know, the Obama administration had a very serious educational reform practice focused on really trying to look at so many of the challenges that we saw in urban America. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Tony Miller as a member of this panel. Tony?
Thank you very much, Bob, for that introduction and for the background. I want to thank Governor Wilder and Dean Gooden for bringing us together. Like Melody, it's special for me. Some of you know I'm actually, I'd say, not personally from Richmond, but my mother's from Richmond, have family in Richmond, and consider this very much a home away from home. So it's a good opportunity to come back, and there's a connectedness in terms of how do we help communities and bring a perspective in communities like Richmond, because there's Richmonds all over the country that are in dire need of innovative, creative solutions if we're really going to address some of the challenges that confront these communities. I say that, and I'll start with an education perspective in terms of the imperative And some of the things we tried to do, and what really has influenced my thinking as we think about this topic of what are some of the effective policies that we might put forward and the role of our urban communities in that context. Things we all know, but I think it's important that we continue to remind ourselves that the incredibly and increasingly important role that education plays in our society, both nationally, locally, and globally. The U.S. has been quoted, our standings in terms of the number of adults, working adults, who have the benefit of some kind of post-secondary degree has fallen dramatically. We used to lead the world, we're in the mid-teens. That's happening at a time when what remains ever more true, and you heard Congressman Scott say, 2/3 of the jobs of the future are going to require some kind of post-secondary degree. We know statistically that the lifetime earnings of folks with that degree and those skills are significantly higher than lower education attainment levels. And if that's not just important enough and motivating enough, the knock-on generational effect continues. We know, given the correlation to income and earnings and household income, that if you don't have the benefit of those degrees and the earnings associated with them, you're more likely to be in the lower income. And if you think about families that are in the bottom 20%, the bottom quintile, what you realize is that's likely they have less than a 10% chance that their children will go on and achieve a higher education degree. So in a world of increasing economic inequality, it is truly imperative that we increase our focus and bring creative solutions to bringing higher education attainment to all, and to do it in an affordable, sustainable way. It's in that context that I actually left the private sector to join Melody in the administrative branch, but to join Congressman Scott in DC to try to make a difference. And as you heard in the introduction, I think there's some real lessons learned in terms of this notion of being creative and thoughtful and a sense of urgency. If we go back to 2009, we can all remember we're at the depth of the recession. It's how do we save jobs, revitalize the economy. And it was in that context that President Obama had declared that education was going to be a domestic policy priority, notwithstanding the economic fiscal crisis. With Melody's leadership in the White House, we had many meetings, right, in the Oval Office, or excuse me, in the White House, if not in the conference room right outside. And with the support of Congress, of the $787 billion that was dedicated towards the stimulus, $100 billion was invested in education. That's a tremendous, saving over 400,000 educator jobs at a time when we all were worried about losing our jobs. So we were stabilizing not just the economy, but trying to stabilize and build a foundation for improving education. During the course of our tenure, we invested $40 billion in the Pell Grant program. We enabled 1.1 million students of color to access higher education. Again, creative solutions. We put together a new framework, a new regulatory framework, to hold higher education institutions more accountable to outcomes, so that many students who would attend, some graduate, many not graduate, were left with burdensome debt and didn't actually get the benefit of their higher education. Well, how do we hold institutions accountable, not just for the effort, but for the outcomes when you're stewarding public resources? We increased the investment in the collaboration, interdepartmental collaboration between Health and Human Services and the Department of Ed to increase funding for early learning, pre-K learning. One of the investments that we know as a society has one of the best returns on investment when you think about investing public dollars. So these were some of the efforts. Is it enough? No. But is it critically important and do we need to build on it? Yes. What's the basis for hope? At this point, we have, in this country, we do have the highest attainment level of graduation rate. We have the highest graduation rates than we've ever experienced. And that's been true not just, if you will, for the average, but for minorities as well. So we are making progress in some ways. But if you look at our urban communities, too often they're not experiencing that same level of progress. They clearly don't always have the same level of hope and sometimes face a spirit of despair. And so how do we think about what might be some solutions? Well, to provide fuel for the discussion with our panel later, I thought I'd just advocate some policy objectives, at least at a high level, and then and approaches to how we need to do those. So in education, one, we need to continue to encourage higher education attainment. But it's important that as we address making sure that higher education is available, it needs to be affordable. Right now, 2/3 of people who graduate with a college degree have some level of debt, with the average debt being about $25,000, between $20,000 and $25,000. Good news is 1/3 don't graduate with any debt, and this is public universities. But when you put the overlay of income, which is often correlated in some of our urban communities, those numbers change significantly. You only have about 12% who graduate with no debt. Almost 90% are graduating with debt and a higher level of debt. The notion of, is college affordable? It's increasingly, is one, not only more expensive, but increasingly the perception of it not being affordable is discouraging people from pursuing post-secondary degrees. And that's incredibly important because it's an environment where we, as I said when I'm opening comments, the actual truth is your lifetime earnings are in fact correlated with a higher degree. So it still remains a good return on investment, but it matters that you complete your degree, and it increasingly matters what areas that you're studying. Another fun fact that I became aware of, 28% of graduates with an associate's degree earn more than the average bachelor degree holder. Earn more than the average bachelor degree holder. Why is that? Because again, while higher and more education generally is correlated with higher earnings, what you matter, STEM fields, technical fields, healthcare fields, fields in demand, with a set of scarce skills, the workforce is demanding those and it translates to higher earnings. So we need to have solutions that can maintain access but increasingly really reward completion, as well as provide more information so that students and parents can make informed choices about what fields of study are going to provide the best return for the dollars that they are investing and the public dollars that we're investing. So if you think about K-12 from a policy perspective, daunting challenge, admittedly a daunting challenge. But the reality is in urban environments, the first thing we need to do is raise our expectations. All too often in too many communities, we kind of have seemed to accept that where you live, your zip code, actually is determinative of your ability to learn. And there's now research out there in terms of the placidity of the brain, the growth mindset, that no, you can actually learn. And so it starts, though, with the belief in the possibility that you can, in fact, accelerate learning. If you couple that belief, it needs leadership, and that's leadership at every level, leadership in the governance structure of the board, leadership in our superintendents and the urban districts, and incredibly important, leadership at the school site. Effective principals help mobilize, engage, and empower educators in the classroom. Support them, you have less turnover, and guess what? You get tremendous results, and you get community engagement. It takes leadership, and it takes that capacity. You couple that in our increasingly technically literate society, as well as these emerging tools, there are now increasingly educational tools that are starting to be proven effective in the hands of skilled educators that actually can, in fact, accelerate learning and can be a useful approach to, in fact, closing the achievement gap. So again, we need a holistic approach to K-12, and we need to continue to invest in early learning. As I say, it's hard to be college ready if you're not showing up kindergarten ready. And so those are the kinds of solutions that we need. But how do we need to do that? And I'll, again, just want to underscore comments that Melody made. The notion of bringing a place-based approach, bringing a collaborative approach, that alignment is incredibly important. Communities need to come together because what you find is there is an interrelationship. The notion of affordable higher education is in the context of, but I've got to pay for housing. I've got to be able to pay for child care. Right? I may have to pay for elder care. I need to be able to afford transportation. It's got to be in the notion of affordability, which is in the context of wages. So you can't just think about what's the solution in terms of education policy outside the context of appropriate housing and affordable housing policy, outside the context of an effective transportation infrastructure. How do we think about healthcare policy? So I think bringing that alignment, and frankly, the challenge the reality is they are different funding streams with different funding bodies. And so it's going to take creative problem solving and policy making to bring more braided funding approaches so that you can pool monies together, still with the appropriate accountability, but to bring holistic approaches to these communities. We also need to foster innovation. I mean, some of these problems, they don't just lend themselves to the tried and true of yesteryear and just greater effort. They truly do require innovation and new approaches. And with that, I'd say you need to leverage collaborations, which have been highlighted, between government, between philanthropy, and between the private sector, right? And NGOs, right? Philanthropy and NGOs. It needs to be an integrative approach. We need to take the best of what the private sector can do, ensuring appropriate safeguards, because we've seen without the appropriate safeguards, the private sector may not always align its incentives for public policy objectives. But if you just leave it to, if you will, the pure public sector, sometimes you don't get the innovative thinking and access to the capital that you need for the breakthroughs that give us things like the iPhone and Google. And so how do we actually bring the best of both those worlds to our urban communities? So in closing, and to the title of By the People, the Role of Urban Communities, I would just say, if you think about the role, I'd like to highlight four aspects of that role. First, to be demanding. Urban communities need to be demanding. And candidly, I don't think urban communities have been demanding enough. Not in the context of education. We used to always, talk about it within the administration and joke about it. But you could go to countries in Asia, and Korea we used to use as the example, where literally they had protests from parents because they didn't have enough English teachers, right, teaching English in Korea in 3rd grade. And we're challenging them on their immigration policy to allow more immigrants who could speak English in their native language to come in. That kind of advocacy in the community, we don't get that here in the United States, right? That level of education is fundamentally important. If you look at these economies, they spend about 6 times more, households spend 6 times more of their discretionary income in education. So the notion of we should be demanding of our policymakers, of our institutions, and of ourselves, so be more demanding. 2, I think our communities, urban communities, need to be more informed. We all have our opinions. We may even have philosophies and ideology. But good policymaking and effective programs require fact-based information, requires continuous improvement and continuous learning. And in today's world, there's more information than has existed in previous worlds, and the ability to digest that information to try and inform truly effective policy is an important aspect of good policymaking. 3rd, I'd say we need to be invested. As I said, as parent, as a student, as an institution, we need to be invested in our communities. That's of our time and of our resources. So everyone has to have skin in the game. And then lastly, and I think it's important, we need to be discerning. Again, we need to take risks. We need to stimulate innovation. But it's recognizing that many of these communities, they've experienced trauma in some way. They've experienced a lack of trust. And so the notion of institutions, especially you think about higher education institutions in our communities, still have trust within those communities. And so what role can they play in helping to curate the host of information and perspectives out there to say these are the ones, whether they could be left, they could be right, but these are the ones that are supported by data, that are proven to have integrity. It's the notion of we're going to have to be discerning and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, nor be accepting of panacea-type solutions. So with that, again, I want to thank our host for convening us, and I look forward to a stimulating panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. It's a real privilege to introduce our last presenter is Dr. Bill Spriggs, because Bill is in so many ways the model of a kind of social science faculty member that VCU and the Wilder School embrace. That I've known his writings on minimum wage for many years, his writings on the connection between race and economic inequality. He's an academic leader in many ways, but at the same time, he's had tremendous public policy experience. He served as Assistant Secretary for the Office in the Department of Labor and the Office of Policy during the first term of the Obama administration. He's currently not only a professor at Howard University, but he's also the chief economist for the AFL-CIO, and he also has an international connection working with them and their advisory committee to the OECD. So he's a person who brings both extraordinary practical experience with very prestigious academic reputation, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Bill Spriggs to our panel tonight.
This is a timer. I'm not looking at a phone call. So thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank your dean. I have admired her work from when she was a junior faculty member at Virginia Tech, and no sooner had I written a letter to support her becoming a tenured professor than VCU stole her away, and to the benefit of VCU. And Bobby Scott and I have been friends since he chose to go from the House to the Senate in Virginia, and I was so ecstatic when he won his congressional race and welcomed him to Washington. And now, those of you who have been to the Congressional Black Caucus dinner know that they introduced the members in seniority level. So I was thrilled when he got elected, but you had to sit through this long list before they got to Congressman Scott. And now his seniority has moved him to the front of the list, and we look forward to him being the chair of the Education and Workforce Committee. And my long work with Melody Barnes when I was at the National Urban League and worrying about who was going to be judges. She worked for Senator Kennedy, and my colleague from the Department of Education from the Obama administration. I've saved the governor for last because this statement that starts the symposium by the people comes from the Gettysburg Address. And I remember when I came to his inauguration and was fearful of where to stand at the Capitol, because when we were going to watch him become governor, as you know, that Capitol is surrounded by statues that don't belong there. And our fear was that those people would come out of their grave, push up the statues, and crush us. Now, I bring up those statues because that's part of the reason some places can't get ahead. Let us differentiate between history or facts, and memory. Memory are what we use to try and interpret those facts and then govern. They're a part of mythology. They're part of making what isn't real, real. It is a fact, yes, it is a fact, that a Confederate flag flew over Richmond. That's a fact. Let me tell you another fact from going to the OECD meetings many times where we meet at the Supreme Headquarters of the United States Army immediately following World War II. It is a fact that the Nazi flag flew over Paris almost as long as the Confederate flag flew over Richmond. Let me give you a warning. Those of you who think, oh, it's just history, do not walk into the city council of Paris with the Nazi flag and argue with them that, well, it flew about as long as it did in Richmond, and if they can fly a Confederate flag, I can fly a Nazi flag. I'm not taking insurance on your life. Now, there's a reason why we want to worry about that memory, because that government to which Abraham Lincoln was speaking, his speech at Gettysburg was against that government. Why? Of the people, by the people, for the people. A government that is not doing that is serving a different master. And if you can reimagine some sort of world, some mythological world in which there are heroes who tried to defend a different form of government, a government which was not of the people, by the people, or for the people, you understand the dilemma. Governor Wilder, Bobby Scott, Melody, we're Virginians too. We're Virginians too. The United States has a middle class because, as you have heard repeatedly, if government works, it's because it's in alignment and because it's trying to do something. We have a middle class because the government did not leave to the marketplace opportunity. Opportunity was not in the marketplace. Nothing, no economic equation guarantees that the result of the market will be people have housing, people have education, people have health. The market does not guarantee that. In fact, if you don't pay attention to inequality, what the market guarantees is that some people won't have housing, won't have education, won't have health. The market will guarantee that because the market allocates according to what you can afford. And at high levels of inequality, the price point that clears the market is too high for a lot of people. When we were a middle-income country, so that 60% of the income was in the middle 60%, then the market appeared to work because people in the middle could afford housing because that's where the market price cleared. They could afford housing because we defended the right of workers to organize, to bargain with their employer, and get health insurance. It worked on education because, as Bobby Scott mentioned and others have mentioned, the government did not treat opportunity in the market. The government ensured it. And so somebody won't say, oh, he's doing a partisan speech. Let us remember in 1862, when there were no Democrats in Congress, the Republican Congress in 1862, when the United States had a GDP per capita of Kenya, in the midst of a civil war, created land-grant universities that created for us MIT, the University of Michigan, the University of California, Berkeley. Imagine Kenya today creating those great universities. In the 1950s, when the Russians launched Sputnik, a Republican, Dwight David Eisenhower, immediately went to Congress and said, no, we are not going to be beaten. We are going to invest in the American people, and laid down and created the student loan system, and the interest rate was going to be lower than prime interest. He didn't make it market interest. He wasn't leaving it to the market. A Republican Congress, a Republican president invested in the American people. They weren't going to let opportunity be in the marketplace. The market cannot guarantee it. If you leave the market for opportunity, you will be guaranteeing, I don't care how much alignment you have, but you are guaranteeing that somebody isn't going to be included because they can't afford it. We have housing because the United States government said to those returning from World War II, we will give you affordable housing loans. The government gave opportunity. It believed in investing in the American people. You cannot solve these problems unless you design to solve the problems. The market cannot do that. A government that only wants to serve the masters will give us inequality and it will give us masters. If you want people who are free, then the government must be by the people and for the people and cannot be afraid of the market, cannot cower to the great job creators. Some of you have a new faith. I never read in my Bible about the job creators. And as Congressman Scott made clear, in addition to making sure that workers could organize and bargain with their employer to get higher wages, we set wage floors. We don't care what business says. People have to make enough money that they aren't poor. You can't be working and poor in the United States. That was the deal we cut. That was agreed to by Dwight David Eisenhower, a Republican president. It was a nonpartisan issue until very recently. Now we've decided, no, you can work and be poor. You know what that means? Someone will be poor. Job training, yep. So I'm going to wrap up. Job training is necessary. We must increase our investment in human capital. We must invest in our public universities so that we are not making them market-driven, so that the University of Virginia will not have more students from the top 1% of the income distribution rather than the bottom 40%. And why do they do that? Because if you want something that's market-driven, it follows the money, it doesn't follow the people, and the money is with the people at the top. They spend over half the money because they have over half the money. You can't make housing affordable if over half the housing dollars are held by the people at the top. If you ask me to build a home, it's because somebody can afford the home. I chase the dollars if I'm a business person. And if the people who have half the market want McMansions, I'm building McMansions. There's no market for me to build low-income housing. They don't have the money. To think that I'm going to build something for somebody who doesn't have money, come on. That's not how the market works. You have to have a minimum wage that lifts people up. If you want to move into the 20th century, if you want to make Richmond one of those places that no longer says, oh, it's July 3rd, 1863, you have to have a minimum wage that moves people up. Guess what? It's $15 an hour. Join the world. Come to the 21st century. You can't do it at $7.25. And for all the businesses who want to say, oh, well, what would I do? What would I do? You know what you would do if everybody in Richmond actually had money? You'd have a lot of customers. A lot of customers. Public policy must do the obvious. If you pay $7.25, you will have poor people. Don't come to me and complain about how am I going to end poverty. You just said you wanted poverty. If I'm going to make colleges a market-driven decision, don't complain to me that no one can afford it. It's market-based. You intended that. You get what you plan for. Public policy must plan for a middle class. That's how we got the middle class. The only way we can rebuild it is to plan for it.
Thanks to all our presenters for some extraordinary remarks. We're going to turn to the second part of our program right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a question to each of our faculty panelists who have strong research interests, and all of them have research interests that are actually very relevant and to the Richmond area, to RVA here. And so I'm going to start with Ben Teresa, who is the co-founder and co-director of the RVA Eviction Lab and assistant professor in the Wilder School of Urban and Regional Studies. I want to move immediately to this issue of evictions and affordable housing. And I want to put it in the context of, if you take a look in so many ways, the Richmond area seems to be prospering. Many people think it's doing better than ever. But at the same time, as Congressman Scott noted, a national study suggested that Richmond and Hampton Roads are two of the top 10 areas in eviction rates, And I think I'm right, Fabrizio, that if you take a look at affordable housing in Richmond, it's becoming less affordable over the past 10 or 20 years considerably. So I'm going to ask Ben to start us off by saying, in terms of what can be done at the local level here, or in conjunction with federal or state policy, what could actually be done on this eviction issue? Because largely it's not just an issue of housing, it's also an issue of education as well, because as people move around and become more transient, much more difficult for students to succeed in school. So just love to hear your approach and to begin the conversation with the panel.
Thank you for that question. And maybe I can start by just kind of re-summarizing kind of the state of the eviction crisis in the country, and particularly for Virginia and the Richmond area. So we know now from data that was collected from the eviction lab at Princeton University under the direction of Matthew Desmond that evictions in the United States are at epidemic proportions, and in particular for Virginia and for Richmond region, also the Hampton Roads area. Virginia has 5 out of the top 10 highest evicting cities in the country, and Richmond is number 2. And so this data that we have now shows us the scale of the problem. It doesn't tell us what to do about it, and it doesn't necessarily tell us how we got here and why evictions are occurring at this scale and how. I would really suggest that the problem of this scale does not occur from one problem. It occurs from many different problems interacting at a level to produce a situation where in Richmond every year 1 out of 10 Richmonders are evicted. In some neighborhoods, the scale of the situation is where you have maybe 1/3 of all residents being evicted when you get down to the neighborhood level. And so it's a question of affordable housing, which has been neglected, and in terms of the affordability overall of the housing stock, the situation has become much worse across the country and in Virginia and in Richmond. It's also, I was pleased to hear from Congressman Scott about the situation with public housing, because actually we learn that public housing has a lower eviction rate than for private housing if you're looking at the same tenancy for people with the same income. They will fare better in public housing. And so I think this really speaks to the need, no doubt, that public housing has problems and we need to address them. But again, the role, as Dr. Spriggs, I believe, was talking about, the role for what can public investments achieve? They can achieve a stability for people, for low-income people, that the market, as we were talking about, cannot. So, what are the more specific kinds of tools and solutions that can be brought to the evictions problem? So, definitely, it's about the affordable housing supply. There's a number of tools at the local level. And so I would hope that the General Assembly would open up the space for a city like Richmond. The governance structure and the relationship between the state of Virginia and its cities is complicated, and so there needs to be the space opened up so that Richmond can pursue policies like inclusionary zoning, which would require or offer additional opportunities for developers to build affordable housing, for the city to in fact require that developers build affordable housing. There has to be additionally a real commitment in terms of financial resources for cities that have tackled the affordable housing crisis. They have to put money behind that. And that's always the challenge, because we have abdicated at the federal level the kind of support for housing. I will say support for housing for the middle class and for low-income people, because we have substantial subsidies at the high end in terms of homeowner deduction and federal subsidy for wealthy homeownership. I also think it means not assuming renters as second-class citizens and second-class status, which means bolstering tenant protections. New York City just passed a means-tested right to counsel. So just as we understand a right to counsel is important in a criminal proceeding, that everyone has the right to appropriate representation. There's also advocates who say that you should have a right to counsel when you're taking to housing court, because for most tenants, if you go to housing court, you're going to be evicted. Very few people emerge from housing court and are able to stay in their home. And so just by passing a right to counsel, eviction rates plummeted. So it was just the idea that there would be a fair representation in the tenant housing court had a dramatic impact. So it definitely involves a variety of solutions in terms of addressing affordable housing supply, addressing how people will move through the housing market and be continually segmented into narrower and narrower choices for housing. And so, for example, you can have someone who has an eviction on their record and the housing choices become extremely limited. If they have bad credit, more so. And if they have unstable income, making minimum wage, perhaps in short-term and temporary positions where they can't save enough a security deposit, that's where you end up with people who are living in short-term motels on the Jefferson Davis corridor, which we have in the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported on last year. And so I really would emphasize the multiple problems that would cause an eviction crisis at the scale that we have.
Congressman Scott, would you like to respond about what kind of mix of federal, state, and local policies do you think are necessary here?
Yeah, basically it's just a matter of priorities. We can afford to end homelessness. Like I said, most estimates are in the $200 billion range over 10 years. We passed a tax cut, $1.5 trillion. So by the time with interest, it's going to be about $200 billion. So you're talking 10% of the tax cut that went, 80% went to top 1% in corporations. So it's just a matter of priorities. And that's where the urban communities can insist that the legislative priorities change from tax cuts to the wealthy to end homelessness.
Bill Spriggs, you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between minimum wage and affordable housing?
The problem with the low minimum wage is severalfold. One, as Congressman Scott was indicating, nowhere in the United States can you afford housing at $7.25 an hour. So you have that you're priced out of the market, and then you have the problem that when you design an economy based on low income, you create such a huge gap between the top and the bottom. As I was mentioning, you make the market imbalanced. So there's no incentive to ever come around to addressing that market. There's no market way to deliver it. So in the more extreme, where you have 60% instead of just 50% being at the top, there's no way someone is going to say, oh, this would be profitable. And so you dig your hole deeper. And then you have people who argue against the government, argue because, oh, you have to keep spending more money on the public housing because you're forcing the public side to make up more of a gap. So you need wages to come up to actually create more of a middle class, shrink the distribution of income so it's more stable and level, and at that rate, then it's possible to capture more people through the market. But the middle class now find themselves being priced out, as Congressman Scott was talking about the decline in home ownership. Even young people coming out of college now are finding that the price point has moved on them. A much higher share of income for those who are 20 to 25 in today's world goes toward housing than was true 30 years ago. They're spending well over 20% more of their income on housing than was true before. That squeezes out the opportunity for them to save for a down payment. It makes it harder for you to then again address the market problem, that the market tilts even further away from them.
That's great. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Siegel-Hawley, whose research has gained national prominence looking at the Richmond area and other metropolitan areas, examining segregation and resegregation. And I'd like to turn to some of the issues raised by Melody Barnes and Tony Miller and others on this panel in light of some of the information that's come out recently about the city of Richmond. It's had a kind of bad week in the newspaper, you might say, for the schools. And the latest story noted that our high schools has the lowest graduation rate in the state of Virginia. And what I'd like you to do is try to address the kind of specific proposals and specific changes that could be made here in the city, in your mind, to kind of improve these graduation rates and ensure that the kids growing up, the young people in the city of Richmond, really have the same kind of future and can share in the prosperity that we're seeing in other parts of the region.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And thank you for having me. I apologize because I have a 4-year-old and she's also a Trojan horse of germs. I think it will get better if I keep talking, but it might not. So I'll make it short. So I think fundamentally, we have to, as the people in this city, confront segregation, school segregation, as a root cause of educational inequality. I think for too long on the local level, we have ignored it. And for far too long on the federal level, we have ignored it. That started to change briefly, beginning with the GAO report that Congressman Scott referenced in 2016. And then I'll tell you this just as a point of hope. We're doing the study of federal civil rights in education under the former and current administration. And one thing we found was that within a year, in the last year of the Obama administration, former Secretary of Education John King came in, and his first priority, his first letter, his first communication to the entire Department of Education was, we are going to make school diversity a priority in the department. And it was woven across all of their competitive grant programs. They had put some money into trying to incentivizing local efforts to come together around school integration. And I say that because it had been 40 years since the federal government had paid attention to school segregation, and it changed within a year. It changed back pretty quickly, but much progress is possible in a short period of time if we keep up focused. So unless we recognize segregation as a root cause of educational inequality, then we're going to keep treating the symptoms of low graduation rates, high rates of absenteeism, enormously high rates of teacher and leadership turnover in urban schools. If we don't see segregation as a cause, rather than a lack of standards and accountability, or a lack of competition that introduces market-based reforms into our schools, then we're going to miss the mark on the solutions. One of the things I found interesting, it has been a bad week in the news for RPS, but a few weeks back, Justin Mattingly at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who's the education reporter, he was interviewing our new superintendents in the region, and we have quite a few. And he said, one of his questions was, our schools remain segregated, what are you going to do about it? And just asking that question was a lot of progress for this region. And I was intrigued by both what Jason Cameron said and what Amy Cashwell said in Henrico. They both talked about a system of secondary school choice rooted in family and student interest that would have some sort of diversity goals governing the system and would offer free transportation and outreach to students. So that's school choice with civil rights protections. And it was going to be school choice within the existing framework of public schools. We have a lot of choice in the Richmond area. We have a lot of specialty centers in our school divisions. We have a number of specialty schools in Richmond. The way that they're currently set up results in a lot of stratification. But if we thought about every school becoming or every high school becoming a theme-based or programmatic school of choice and working to make sure that they were all diverse. I think that would be one step in the right direction.
Thanks so much. Melody Barnes, could you respond to that and also talk a little bit about what seemed to work best in Nashville to increase the graduation rates there?
Sure, absolutely. One, I completely agree with your comment that we have to start being fact and evidence-based in our approach to what the problem is, and the deep-rooted nature of segregation. The role that housing patterns, transportation, and we created a system, and now people are acting as though we're surprised that we have the system that was originally created, and the reasons why it was created. And we can look at the history here, but places all over the country to better understand that. I think, one, you were talking about what Superintendent Cameras has articulated as a way to start to attract a whole host of students to different kinds of schools based on themes and interests. But at the same time, and I think this goes to one of the things that Bill was talking about, creating at least a floor of civil rights protections. The government has to have a North Star for what it believes in and what we're striving for that will protect students in that process. But in doing that, trying to desegregate the schools. I think about the schools that I attended when I was here in the 70s and 80s, and what those schools looked like then and what they look like now, and the ways that we're going to have to try and desegregate the school system. And that's one way of going about doing it, as we're also addressing issues of housing and transportation. At the same time, we also have to be realistic about the experiences of the students that are populating our schools right now. And in not only aspiring to and looking at the assets that those students are, the talent and the skills that those students have, and the fact that that talent is distributed widely, but that the opportunity is not. And at the same time address the significant trauma that many of those students have had and the supports and the services that they need in the school system and outside of the school system, and the role that institutions, and I've talked about nonprofit institutions and others, must play to provide them with the kind of support that they need so that they can be successful in the school system. I think that's one of the reasons why cities like Nashville, as they've started to address the challenges that they've had, have been making significant significant progress in achieving levels of success, because they have brought a whole host of supports and systems to surround those students. We often focus on those individual programs, but we have to look at the cleavage between the programs and think about what we're doing on a system level so that we can get to scale and so that we can provide that kind of support to a whole host of students, to every student that sits in our school system, when we know that virtually 95% of them or more are students that are coming from economically challenged backgrounds. And some of the stories that you hear when you talk to communities and schools and other kinds of programs, and you recognize the kinds of challenges that they have and the kinds of challenges that teachers and principals and assistant principals have when they're trying to serve them. But we have to think about how do we provide that kind of support, but also how are we going to attract every student to the school system to deal with issues of segregation that are challenging Richmond, but challenging other systems around the country.
How about pass it to Tony Miller, maybe? And Tony, why don't you go on, talk a little bit about the key innovations that you think can address some of these issues?
Sure, thank you. Let me compliment, not just repeat, but compliment. I do think it's been clear that the resegregation is a real concern, risk, and the adverse impact of that is pretty clear. And I think it's got to be a policy priority to prevent the resegregation of our schools. And we need to provide the supports that Melody talked about. But let me also tell you another story. Again, it's meant to complement, not to be a substitute. In Chicago's just been recognized as leading the country from suburban districts in terms of academic progress. And people would argue, I mean, they have some of the most, it's one of the most violent communities, right? We talk about, and the former secretary, right, has committed himself to addressing this notion of the violent nature that's happening on the south and west sides of Chicago. It's also one of the most segregated cities when you look at housing, in historical housing. And so it's the notion of, while we address some of these fundamental, abhorrent kind of attempts, right, be it active or tacit, to allow for the resegregation. At the same time, we have to accept the schools where they are and also be unrelenting about driving performance. And that's possible. And this is why I was going in my earlier comments. It's the art of the possible. Things that Chicago has done, for example, and it didn't happen, this happened over 10 years. So I'd say it's the cumulative effort over an extended period of time of sustained effort. But it's things, an intense use of data. There was a long-term partnership with the University of Chicago. Really, for the first time, looking at data at scale and analysis, and simple things like realizing that the on-track rate in 9th grade was highly predictive of how you were going to, in fact, if you were on track to graduate. And then you need to further on to say, and then how likely were you to not just graduate, but to score reasonably well on the college entrance exams to go on to post-secondary. And so with that, again, there's a whole lot of different metrics, but you realize we need to solve the problem at the 9th grade level, right? At the junior and senior level, unfortunately, it is too late. So you have your K-8 policy, but you also need to have intense focus on it. And it was the data that informed that. What was the other reality? Again, very unpopular, and we were criticized for it, but I think we do have to challenge the status quo. Oftentimes in these communities, there are schools that have failed for decades, that have been abysmal failures for decades. And the reality is, recognizing that they're an important part of the community, all too often the community still supports these schools because it's the fear that what's going to be substitute that, right, and be disruptive to those students and those parents is worse. And the reality is it's not. The reality is those kids are failing, will fail, and we're condemning them to a risk of, at best, minimum wage, oftentimes unemployment, crime, right, and tackling. And so we have to be very bold. It's very unpopular, but you have to be very bold and, in fact, being very, if you will, dramatic with the interventions in some of the most troubled and failing schools in these communities. I think that's important. I think you have to recognize and reward there is effective teaching going on. And so we have a tendency to paint some of these communities with a broad brush, right? Even Richmond Public Schools, I would argue, there are some classrooms and some teachers that are having disproportionately successful results.
Oh, absolutely.
But I'm not sure they're known. I'm not sure they know in terms of the data. They're not celebrated. There's not the professional development that allows them to serve as coaches. And so how do you actually, when we talk about building the capacity, how do you actually take what's proven effective in certain schools and certain classrooms, highlight those and promulgate those? And so I think, if you will, you need to have a dual program, dual policy objectives and programmatic objectives to take the schools where they are in the current construct and at the same time get at some of these pernicious policies and pursue a policy agenda, recognizing that some of those, depending on the context, may take longer.
Great. Congressman Scott, hate to do the what-if question, but if the Democrats won the House and you'd be the chair of Education and Workforce, what would be your top 3 or 4 priorities as committee chair, and how that would differ from what we're seeing now?
To focus on early childhood education, school equity, and access to affordable, quality higher education. Start to finish, one of the challenges we're going to have, I thought you were going to ask about segregation, because if the president nominee is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it's going to be difficult to do anything about segregation, because your tools, anytime, if you want to use race to solve the problem, any use of race is inherently suspect, and legally you subject that action to what's called strict scrutiny. A twofold test. First, you have to have a compelling state interest to do what you're doing, diversity or in segregation, and your action must be narrowly tailored to achieve that goal. You can't do anything and everything. You have to do just enough to conform to your compelling state interest. And if diversity is not a compelling state interest, and you got 4 justices today that do not believe that it's a compelling state interest, then you fail on strict scrutiny. What you're doing to solve the problem you're going to solve fails. And you've had recent voluntary school desegregation plans in Seattle and in Kentucky that were thrown out because it did not survive strict scrutiny. Now, if you're trying to desegregate the schools and you get thrown out of court, I mean, you know, who's going to try that again? And so desegregating the schools with a 5th justice that would join the other 4 is going to be problematic. Kennedy was kind of all over the place, back and forth, and occasionally he would cast a problematic 5th vote. But if you have a solid 5th vote, it's going to be very difficult to do anything. And so we get back to the priorities, trying to create equity so that people have a fair opportunity may be challenging under a new Supreme Court regime where you actually can't notice gross disparities, where all the blacks are getting disciplined and none of the whites are getting disciplined. And in Washington, D.C., in the juvenile justice system, there are virtually no whites in confinement. I mean, like, none. You know, you ask people in the system, you ever seen a white child in the detention? You got hundreds of blacks and Hispanics, and they're hard-pressed to find one. Now, if you cannot use race to fix this, if you can't show intentional discrimination, I'm not sure with that 5th vote you can do anything about it. And so getting equitable education may well be a challenge.
Governor Wilder, would you like to say a few words about this?
I'm going to pass.
Okay. Let me turn to Fabrizio Fazzullo, who's director of the Wilder School Center for Urban and Regional Analysis. And Fabrizio, I think I might be right about this, but as you look at this region, what you're seeing is a real transformation of the region's economy over time. And you're seeing, for example, more affluent people moving back to Richmond, putting some pressure on housing in Richmond. But at the same time, you're seeing some of the issues that people once associated with Richmond, certainly in Henrico, Chesterfield, and the surrounding counties as well. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the landscape of that regional inequality that we're now seeing, and what are some of the challenges in addressing that?
Well, there's been a lot of change in the past decade, I would say, in the Richmond region, and we have done a couple of studies that kind of give a landscape of how these changes are happening. One study in particular, we looked at the location of affordable housing in the region and jobs, in particular modest wage jobs, under the assumption that require less skills and less educational attainment. And the first thing that comes up from the charts and the tables that we created is that there is a strong imbalance between the availability of affordable housing and availability of jobs. The region has this kind of, I say, centric shape in which you have the urban area where right now you have a lot of, it's decreasing, but you have higher affordable housing than the rest of the region. And then most of the jobs that we are talking about are located in different corridors. So the west end of the city, Chesterfield, along Route 60 and so forth. So this is the first problem, this is a stark imbalance. Now, another aspect of this is transportation. So most of the jobs we are talking about are jobs that have an additional problem, which is reliability of employees. When you don't have a transportation system, in particular a public transit system, that allows for reaching the workplace in time, that creates a problem for both the employers and employees. We have done several studies in the past few years interviewing all level of income in Richmond, and one of the problems was, especially among the lowest income residents of the city and the region, that they rely often on family networks, family and friends network in reaching the job place. And this is another important aspect. We always talk about concentrated poverty. We rarely discuss about community resilience and the capacity of this community to create positive networks to help the members of those communities. So that's another thing to consider moving forward. It's another way to look at the issue, and I think it's a more productive way to look at the issue. Another aspect that I think we should consider is how the income growth is changing in the region. For many decades, and this is the case for many metropolitan areas in the United States, the income growth was mostly concentrated in suburban areas, while the urban communities were those experiencing mostly high concentration of poverty and lower income. This is still the case, but if we look at the Richmond region for the past 16 years, this is the first time that we see that the city, so within the city boundaries, income are growing more than the surrounding counties, and in particular Chesterfield and Henrico. Hanover is still doing pretty well compared to Richmond. And this creates two problems. On one side, we are seeing, as you were saying, you were mentioning, an influx of higher income, higher education households in the Richmond region, which creates a problem of gentrification, which we can touch, and it could be a completely different symposium, and we can talk for hours about that. And on the other side, we're seeing also the an increased level of poverty in areas that were traditionally more vibrant from an economic perspective. That creates a problem for the surrounding counties as well. I have to say the Richmond region, though, in my opinion, I came here 12 years ago, and 12 years ago talking about expanding GRTC was almost impossible, if not, there was no style, if you want, a reaction to it. The region is doing, is improving in the way it's thinking about regional cooperation, and I think this is due to a new wave of leaders that we have that gets it. It's improving in providing transportation and better transportation, and these are numbers from this morning, so it's kind of a worldwide release premiere if you want. But we looked at the GRTC coverage before and after the new reroutes. And while there is a sharp increase in the coverage of job plays and businesses, I think it's between 5 and 8%, which is sensitive. If we look at the accessibility, in particular bus accessibility, for the lowest income segment of the population, unfortunately the coverage decreased by 4 to 8%. That tells us we still have a long way to go, and probably there needs to be better conversation. If I have a minute, I think doing some readings in preparation of the symposium, I stumbled across what's called the approach, multi-stakeholder approach to leadership by Carl Schwab. He's the founder of the World Economic Forum. That's mostly applied to businesses, but I wonder if it shouldn't be applied also to local governments. That approach in a nutshell says that basically a CEO of a company shouldn't just care about its shareholders or their shareholders. They should also consider stakeholders of the community at large, meaning buyers, employees, suppliers, and so forth. I think the same needs to be done for local governments. I don't know if it was a mistake or not. There is for sure some merit in what has been done so far. But American politics, I'm talking right now as a European, you may have guessed from the accent, I'm not really familiar. American politics focus on meeting the desires and the wants of businesses, with the bottom line that business is going to provide jobs for citizens. And it's usually how it works. Unfortunately, we need also to look at the numbers and what happened after the economic recession. It's been already like probably 8 or 9 years that we came out of the recession. Employment is down and everything. But if you look at the indicators of income inequality, we have increased those indicators. So that means inequality is increased. Who was not doing that well before the recession is doing even worse after. And we lost most of that middle income that we were discussing before. So if we reverse the paradigm, or if we expand the paradigm, and we consider all segments of the population as stakeholders of a local government, things can change. And this is particularly hard to do because we have a history, a really sad history of marginalization, disenfranchising. And today we have an entire segment of the population, for the most part overlapping with the Black and Latino communities, they don't have a seat at the table. And it's not just they don't have a seat at the table, they cannot even tell the story. From this perspective, for instance, at the university, but also I do mostly consulting work more than research per se, we are starting to adopt as much as we can a community co-researching approach, where it's not just us from the ivory tower looking at what's happening and trying to interpret the numbers, but creating a more compelling story of what's happening really in those communities where any of these economic renaissance the Richmond is experiencing, which I think is very important also for the lower-income communities, but they are not reaping any benefit right now. And I think this is a situation that cannot continue for a long time.
Okay, thanks. Bill, could you respond to Fabrizio and talking about the sort of new geography of inequality that's developing as well?
Yes, it's exactly as he described. It's becoming a problem for the suburbs as they have aged and the housing stock there aged, and those homes eventually became affordable. People who once had been locked out of jobs moved to those job opportunities, and now you have suburbs that have to deal with people being priced out of other amenities within the community. I want to reemphasize his point about transportation, however. It's one thing to get reliable transportation, but that doesn't always help poor people. I was always frustrated when I would sit in meetings on job training where people would say, these people don't care about coming to work on time. And I was thinking, no, you've never ridden a bus. That's what that statement means. We have one-time bus service. The bus comes to this community every 45 minutes. If you miss a bus that comes every 45 minutes, that means even though I missed it by 2 minutes, I'm not 2 minutes late to work. I'm 45 minutes late to work. See, those of you who have a car, you don't worry about it. If you're 2 minutes late getting in your car, then that means, unfortunately, somewhere you go 55 when you're supposed to go 40. You know, we know this truth. So this is a severe problem. The other part of the comments I really want to drive home. We live in an economic ecosphere. It's not just the natural ecosphere, but there's an economic ecosphere. And when you create too much imbalance in the economy, it's the same as creating imbalance within the natural ecosphere. So just as you can't have humans keep putting carbon dioxide into the air and think that that's going to be okay, you can't keep boosting inequality. And as was mentioned, if you think as a politician, my job is to make businesses more profitable, that's what you will get. If you think more profitable businesses mean workers get paid more money, you're wrong. You're wrong. You've just created more profitable businesses. That's all you have done. The reason why we had a middle class is that's not what we worried about. If you create high wages, including having a higher minimum wage, and don't tell me, oh, well, we'll just train the people. Okay, but you're telling me which ones you want to save. At the end of the day, somebody's still going to do that job. When you tell me, well, McDonald's workers don't deserve $15 an hour, somebody is going to be working at McDonald's. So you just told me somebody's making $7.25 and you're okay with that. So it's not a solution. So including minimum wages. When you do that, you are creating the customers from which businesses have the opportunity to profit. Businesses profit when you create customers for them. That's how we used to run our government. We create more customers. You as a business person, you figure out how to get them. We didn't create more slaves, but that's what we're doing now. So when you say, oh, you can't get food stamps unless you work for $7.25 an hour, you're creating more slaves. I'm going to put you back in prison unless you hurry up and find this $7.25 an hour job. I created more slaves. If I say you can't take this job because you're not documented, I'm creating more slaves. I'm creating more people who have to work at whatever they can grovel to get. That's not creating a customer. The transportation problems are very complex when you insist on a low-wage economy. Businesses have to understand they live in an economic ecosphere. If you want workers who show up on time, somebody has to invest to make that happen. Because if I get paid $7.25 an hour and I show up to the car dealership, they're just going to look at me. Like, are you here to wash cars? Or what are you here for? You're not buying one, because at $7.25 an hour, you're not buying one. How do you think your workers are going to get to work? I'm complaining, I can't find enough workers. You agree to $7.25 an hour. I want to buy a Porsche. I mean, you know, so, I mean, we all have wishes. You got to pay for it. Henry Ford famously said, there's no way to make it saving on labor. Henry Ford, who hated the UAW and virtually excommunicated his son because he agreed to sign the contract, but Henry Ford said, you can't save on cheap labor. That's like saving on cheap material. You can't make a car with cheap material, and you can't make a car with cheap labor. And so businesses who think that the government is supposed to help keep giving them cheap labor, you're not going to make a successful society. Listen to old radio programs. This is my hobby. Listen to old radio programs from the 1950s, and you will hear businesses like even U.S. Steel bragging about how much money they spent on their workers and on training their workers. And listen to businesses today. Oh, the kids come from school and they don't know anything, and I can't hire anybody because they don't know anything. U.S. Steel was running advertisements telling how they took people who had been on the shop floor and now they were supervisors of the factory because they spent tons of money on the person's education. They lifted it up as this is what U.S. Steel does to invest in this worker.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was great. Anyway, we have a few minutes left. We'd like to open this up to anybody who has a question for the panelists. We're going to ask you to stand up if you have it, and I think Pam's going to try to bring a mic if we can find that.
Oh. Thank you. I thought that this was very, very informative, but I would ask each of the panelists, particularly those of you that are professors, to also consider the issue of rural communities. Those individuals with these same issues of education and transportation, there's nobody speaking for them. And they can't get to the jobs that's in the cities and do all of these things, and there's still a requirement. And when we talk about affordable housing, what does that really mean? Because it seems like when it's affordable, the people it was designed for, they no longer have access to it or the information thereof. So in those studies and the preparation of that, please consider rural communities.
Okay, thanks very much. Other questions or comments that people want to make? Okay, well, I'm going to ask Governor Wilder then to...
I think you had some questions that were sent in that could be asked at this time.
Here's one for it. A recent Washington Post article suggests that college rankings need more focus on graduation rates of low-income students. In what ways might large, urban, public research universities like VCU be affected by, prepare for, or benefit from these changes if implemented? I'll ask Genevieve first, and then Tony to comment on that.
Not to get a degree in microphones. So the question is, how will the accountability impact higher ed institutions like VCU?
Yeah, I think the question is really how do large urban universities focus attention on graduation rates of low-income students? How can we, help students not just matriculate, but graduate and ensure that they have that opportunity for prosperity and to live a life they choose?
Well, I think it's our duty. I think we've done a good job at VCU with access, but we need to do much more as an institution in terms of support for students when they're here.
Mm-hmm. Tony, I know you said this is a big issue for you.
Yeah, I think, so that'd be separate from VCU, first of all, just overall. I think people are always surprised that the overall completion rate, think about the 6-year graduation rate, is below 60%. So you have, over 40% of students who enter a 4-year college don't graduate in 6 years. So I'd say this is a challenge. This is kind of the changing role of higher education. And it's been historically a notion of qualified students get in, it's a place where you grow, develop, learn, and if you apply yourself, you graduate. If you don't, it's kind of on you. It's a personal accountability. And the accountability wasn't with the institution to ensure. They were giving you the opportunity, but it wasn't holding your hand. It was kind of the transition to adulthood. And, but I think in today's world, that role has and has to continue to change, where institutions should be more accountable, and candidly, there should be recognized with more transparency, or who are doing an especially good job of having their students complete. You could imagine you find state-based funding, incentive-based funding that are trying to put some incentives and some financial rewards. And you can imagine where it gets very complicated, but here's where the role that research could inform it. If you could then do that where you can risk adjust the student population. And you say there are students with different risk factors, different socioeconomic backgrounds. You can imagine they may not, and you see this, they don't always complete at the same rate, at the same pace, as some who are more academically prepared when they come in. So you should be able to recognize and reward institutions that do an especially good job of getting those students to complete. And do so, I would argue, at an affordable debt load. So this notion of, it's hard to get a return on investment as a student or as a parent if you don't complete. But you can also, if you will, pay more than you're going to get the full benefit of relative to some other institutions. And I think that then, with more incentives for higher ed, more transparency, now you can imagine your high school leavers and other adults who go back to school can make more informed choices about which institutions they choose to attend.
Right. Melody.
Just adding to that, Freeman Rabowski, who is the president of the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, African-American Hampton University graduate, consistently known as one of the best college leaders in the country. And you look at the data that comes out of UMBC, he's graduating more students of color in STEM fields. He also has a very strong arts and humanities program, but in STEM fields who also go on to get PhDs in their fields. And some of the things that he talks about, I think, align with what Tony was just talking about. But one, looking at and being able to understand what's happening when a student walks in the door and what the challenges are and how to support them. Also, cohort models of learning, that we have to start to rethink how we're educating students as opposed to a cookie-cutter manner that we've done so for literally hundreds of years. And that those cohort models allow students to work together as a team. It's not a zero-sum game, dog eat dog, you win, I lose model of education. And you find that students are able to matriculate and to do so on time and in extremely difficult subjects year over year over year. And he's written several books about the way that we can better educate low-income students, which also goes to the fact that there are models out there. There's evidence that supports a way to do this, and if more institutions are looking at those kinds of models, we'll find that we're able to replicate those kinds of results.
Yeah. Bill, and I would just mention that VCU, since I'm on the board, we're very proud that our graduation rate among disadvantaged minorities is actually even a little higher than it is among whites.
Well, I think the conversation still needs to be tempered. Many of the schools that people talk about still don't work on the access question. So here's a reality for the United States. White children are now in absolute number on the decline. They are no longer the majority. So when you look at College Board data and you see that whites are not the majority anymore of college-going students, that's why Harvard's current freshman class is not majority white. That's who's in the United States. 60% of black children in college come from a family where the maximum expected family contribution is 0. 60%, the maximum is 0. If you're going to educate black children to scale, no offense to Freeman, to scale, as our historically black colleges do, because graduating 300 or 400 is not to scale, then you can have state policies like this that were mentioned work against the schools that give access. So South Carolina has drastically cut its investment at South Carolina State. Louisiana went from one of the leading producers of blacks in STEM to not on the map because they massively de-invested in Grambling and in Southern University. And Southern University went from being the largest black college in the United States to being some interesting college. Nothing says you got to finish in 6 years, and if your family has 0 expected income, we have to come with some realities of what does it mean if hundreds of my students, not tens of my students, hundreds of my students, come from families with the maximum is 0. This is a great strain not only on the institution, but it's a great strain on the student. Soon, very soon in their career at Howard University, our students make more money than their parents. We talk about opportunity cost, but opportunity cost is kind of a relative thing. Suddenly, when everybody in your family, your siblings, your parents understand that you, right now, you don't even have a degree and you make more money than us. You sitting around in class is expensive, really expensive. So you have to deal with those realities. And if you want to enforce these notions, then you get what we currently have. The current model of American higher education is, I don't want those students because if you're going to hold me accountable, I'm going to keep them low enough that I can get their graduation rate up. So you can't do the formula on graduation rate. It has to be graduation rate times access because we have to be worried about scale. If you look at it from that perspective, then historically black colleges look fantastic because if you take who do we give access to times our graduation rates, we do it to scale. And it keeps you from punishing people who say, I'm going to have 1,800 black kids. You're not going to get 1,800 black kids if you're going to say, I want them all to finish in 6 years, unless you change the way you fund and support education. Pell Grant should not be based on parents' income. Education is now a wealth issue. Access and figuring out what the parents can contribute should be based on wealth, not on income. And once you do that, and once you include a negative factor, remember, because the parent is at 60% zero, zero doesn't mean that maybe I shouldn't even be giving you more. The formula maxes out at too low a level if my family actually has 0 as an expected contribution. And so until you fix the formula so that you take into account a negative so that people can get above the maximum, and until you use wealth instead of income, you can't address this problem. And it can't just be the institution because the institutions themselves that take that opportunity don't have multi-billion-dollar endowments. Hold Harvard accountable. With their billions of dollars in endowment, what are you doing with the billions of dollars in endowment? But holding the schools that hold out the opportunity, who don't have endowments, who can't charge enough money in tuition, that's wrong-headed, and that's not going to get us to scale. Of the 10 leading institutions that produce minorities in STEM, 6 of them are historically black colleges. UMBC is not on the list. It's not on the list. It's not on the top 10. It's in the top 15. It's in the top 15, but it's not in the top 10.
I don't go to UMBC.
Let me ask Congressman Scott and Melody Barnes and Tony one final question here, and that is related to the second title of the committee that you may be chairing in a few weeks, workforce development. And Tony mentioned this in some ways earlier when he mentioned that in terms of community college associate degrees, that in some instances the pay that's coming out of those degrees is higher than some four-year college graduates would get. Or you even see it at Newport News Shipbuilding. Some of the people in the apprentice school are four-year college graduates who now go to try to develop a talent there. And we hear from a lot of businesses, as Bill said before, that there's a mismatch between the skills that students have coming out of high school, perhaps, and the jobs that are available right now. In terms of where we ought to go in workforce development, and in terms of how we need to go in terms of career preparation for young people, what do you think we have to do?
Well, there's a lot we have to do and a lot we're doing. We just passed, although people read the papers, don't think we're doing anything, we did pass a career and technical education bill that coordinates vocational education, high school through community college and adult education, and that and we have adopted what was the belief when I was in the state senate. I was on a job training commission, and one of the things we pushed was if you're going to do vocational education in high school, you should not put children into a rut they can't get out of, like shop. They get to 12th grade and they don't want to go to college where they haven't taken any courses. All of the vocational education now is learning the basics in a different setting. So if junior or senior year you all of a sudden want to go to a four-year liberal arts college, you still have the basics, and you may not use the welding that you learned, but you've got the basics, you can go to college. One of the things I'm concerned about is the discussion about vocational education and job-specific training ought to be in addition to the education, not in lieu of. Well, one of the things that's concerning me is people are saying, well, college is too expensive. You got to borrow so much money, and they calculate whether it's worth it. And then you say, well, there's an alternative. You can get job training or community college and do okay. Well, I think that's the wrong answer. I think the answer ought to be, well, we got to get college more affordable. If somebody wants to be a history major, the fact of the matter is you're not going to be able to monetize that education in such a way that you can compete with a STEM or some other kind of engineering degree. All you have is an education. Now, to some people, that's a bad thing. I believe it's a good thing. And when I say some people believe it's a bad thing, about a year ago, there was a poll taken by Pew Center, a reputable firm, where 2/3 of Republicans said that colleges and universities have a negative effect on the way things are going in the United States today. Now, if that's attitude, try to get Pell Grants funded, or try to get a liberal arts degree. I believe there's significant value to society to have people have a four-year on-campus liberal arts college experience. 90% of the value, it has nothing to do with what you learn in the classroom, but you come out as a transformed person ready to contribute to society. Now, you may not monetize it. You may have to go to a career school or community college to learn a skill so you can get a job. If all you've got is a philosophy or history degree, if you're not going to teach, it's hard to monetize that. But I think we've got to be careful where we denigrate the four-year on-campus liberal arts experience and allow that to be a luxury that only people, I was talking to somebody yesterday, said UCLA costs $60,000 a year for out-of-state students. Private colleges, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $65,000 is not unusual. Well, if you can't write those kind of checks and you're unwilling to incur that kind of debt, well, college isn't for you, you got to go to somewhere else. Even though you're academically qualified, I think that is a major step back in where we were since 1965 when Lyndon Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, and he said this legislation means that any student in any state can apply to any college and university and not be turned away because the family's poor. And that was the case. If you can get in, you could go. You can Pell Grant. Maybe have to work during the summer or during the school year, but virtually everybody could go to about any school and come out virtually debt-free. Maybe a little teeny debt, but you could go. You could work your way through college. Minimum wage job, summer during the school year. Now, 40 hours a week, you can hardly afford school without coming out with crushing debt. That's why millennials can't buy houses today. And so a challenge in higher education and workforce is, first of all, how are you going to treat a liberal arts degree? Is this going to be a luxury that only the rich can afford, or something we want to maintain as something available to everybody? Now, if you're not getting that liberal arts, or you're going into something that you're going to be able to monetize, then we have to have those programs available. For trade schools, the fact of the matter is that the jobs are there. I understand, if you got a welding certificate, you don't even get interviewed. You get hired, and then you get interviewed. That if you've got other trades in shipbuilding, particularly with the increase in shipbuilding budget that we have in the recent defense bill, all of those trades are going to pay extremely well, better probably than a liberal arts degree. But if we're going to have a society that works, we got to have people that just have good education. Now, you don't want everybody with a philosophy degree. You would like a plumber or an electrician somewhere. But we can't, I don't think society works if the liberal arts college experience is limited just to the people that can stroke $50,000 a year checks.
Yeah, thank you. Tony.
Sure, no surprise, I would agree, wholeheartedly with the congressman that we have to ensure that college, especially as we all think about it, and the liberal arts degree remains affordable. It's, that foundational experience is such a rich, and if you think about the pace at which the economy is changing, having that solid foundation is going to be the basis for lifelong learning for many adults. But I think, in particular, you talk about the education, then you combine with the workforce. I think the other part of the reality is there's 30 million Americans today, right, adults who have some but not completed college, right, who are going to be faced with new emerging market opportunities, disruptive technologies, and are going to require to go back and not just get skills, but also get degrees. And so thinking about, today, statistically, the average college student is not your high school leaver, right? It's not an 18-year-old who just graduated high school. And so one of the strengths of our higher education system historically, when you travel around the world, is its diversity, is the notion that there are public and private and community colleges, and there are different pathways. I think we need to make those pathways much more nimble so that you can start and matriculate, right? And much more of a predetermined pathway should you choose, so there's more transparency and less uncertainty. And I think that notion of some will go directly into a 4-year, some will start at a 2-year, some may start in some kind of credential in the workforce, but then go back to community college, and then transition to a state school, may go to graduate school. But I think that's the model that we need to embrace. We need to have a financing mechanism that provides the appropriate level of funds to that so that you can participate in it in an affordable way. And one of the challenges is, as you get more flexible in these financing models, you have to ensure quality. We've seen that, in pursuit of an outcome, you get the lack of quality, and so you never get the benefit. You invest the dollars, both from the student or as a taxpayer, and you don't get the benefit because the quality of the education, the value of the credential is not there. So I think those are some of the things that, are the potential of our higher education system, and I'm sure that's something, with hopefully Chairman Scott and, with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, we'll have the great opportunity to provide leadership on.
Yeah. Melody, do you want to?
Really, I think Tony touched on most of the things I was going to say. As a history major, I have deep belief, and my father's sitting there, I think he has deep belief in the value of a liberal arts education since he paid for it. But I also believe, and one of the reasons I'm so proud of the work that we did when we were still in the administration was to put significant resources into the community college system as an additional avenue for not only young people, but for adults. As Tony said, it can be a starting place for a credential or certification or 2-year degree, and it also can be a place that people come back to for additional learning and training at mid-career or as they're making a career change. So we certainly have seen the benefit of that. One of the organizations I'm affiliated with, Europe, Year Up, and I'm on their national board, focuses on young adults who have come out of particularly challenging situations. Our model now is to think about ways that we can partner with community colleges, and what we're seeing is that more young people not only are getting in-classroom training that they need and the internships that they need, but they're able to convert those into careers. And a lot of the young people who started with us are now in positions where they are hiring people out of the Year Up program because of that kind of education and training.
Yeah, I would just echo what Congressman Scott said about the changing nature of affordability over the years. I was a first-generation college student, did exactly that, worked through school, worked in summers, never thought about going out with debt. It wasn't something that you had to do, and there's no possible way that someone could work the jobs I worked in college and not come out today with $30,000 or $40,000 worth of debt on that. So I think you've really hit the nail on the head. Right now I'm going to turn it over to Governor Wilder and Dean Gooden for their concluding remarks.
Well, thank you so much, and a special thank you to Bob Holsworth for doing an excellent job in moderating this panel and engaging us in this really rich and important discussion. I would also like to thank each of our panelists for the outstanding job that they have done in terms of really having us call into question some of the things that I think we take for granted. For some of the things, like markets that we think, hey, I think we've really deepened our thinking behind these and how they operate. I want to offer a special thanks, of course, to Congressman Scott for his spending time with us and for all the leadership that you have provided, to Ms. Barnes, to Mr. Miller, Dr. Spriggs, Dr. Frizzulo, Dr. Siegel-Hawley, and Dr. Teresa. And, of course, I want to acknowledge and thank the excellent leadership, not only of our school, but the leadership that he has provided over the years to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the thought leader behind the symposium, and that is the Honorable L. Douglas Wilder. Thank you, Governor Wilder. You have comments?
Well, let me thank you, and I can't thank the panel and the faculty members enough. This has been a most stimulating evening for me, and I know for those who have seen their relatives do so well. I know the Barnes, Charlie Barnes, my good buddy, and his charming wife with Melody, and Tony danced around it, but he is my nephew, and he speaks of his mother being from Richmond, my youngest sister, and I have relatives here, his aunt and his cousins and others. So we are very proud of you, but more importantly, I think we planted a seed here that we've continued to try to nourish and encourage people to do the kinds of things. Wouldn't it be good if we could have this propagated across the nation? Wouldn't it be beautiful if we could have these occasions where people would understand that they can be heard, that they do mean and make a difference? And to the extent that you've taken of your time, your energies, and I don't mind telling you, most of these people, if not all of them, have come here for little or nothing. They volunteered their services, and I think they should be kind of it. And with that, I will turn it back over to the good dean, who has, as I've indicated before, provided such great leadership, and that will continue. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Governor. I would like to also encourage everyone, we have a reception immediately following. I want to let all our panelists know that to the right of their seat, there's a small gift, as Governor Wilder said, in lieu of the large salary. So we do have a small gift. And I'd like to thank our communications team, our administrative assistants, our event organizers, and our student workers for all of their service tonight. So please continue to interact, continue the discussion, and enjoy the reception. Thank you, everyone.